Thank you for joining us again for this week's edition of Ask a Historian with Heritage Mississauga. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And each week we invite you to send in your questions, your curiosities, and we'll explore the fascinating history of the city of Mississauga together. Thank you, Sarah, for the fascinating question around the history of the vineyard in historic Mississauga. And yes, indeed, you will see the Welcome to Cooksville village signs on Dundas Street and on here Ontario Street that make mention of Canada's first wine-growing or winemaking capital. Cooksville was home to a vineyard, but like any good history, if you will, it requires a little sleuthing to get to the truth of the matter. There's some myths, there's some unknowns, there's some legends, and then there is the factual story. All of which is fascinating. And yes, indeed, Cooksville was home to the very first commercial vineyard in Canada. But its story, the factual story, is not the one that has resonated down in time. It's the myths that have carried on. And in brief, we'll touch on that today. And a lot of this is thanks to the late Professor Richard Jarrell, who did an exceptional work many years ago, delving into kind of those myths and realities around the history of Clare House wines, Chateau Clare to later generations, but the Canadian Vine Growers Association and the first commercial vineyard in Canada, which was established in 1864 and 1865 and operated roughly until about 1926. So it's a little bit of a point of pride when you see those signs for anyone who enjoys their glass of wine. We have the Canadian Vine Growers has its roots here in historic Mississauga, particularly around the intersection of what is now Parker Hill Road and Dundas Street, just to the west of Confederation Avenue, formerly known as Hook Avenue. But the story is riddled with kind of myths and legends, if you will, and deciphering them is kind of the fun part of the story. There's several versions of the origin story, the myth, if you will, but the gist of it is that Corporal Johann Schiller founded the Ontario founded the Ontario wine industry. He was a Rhinelander who served in the British Army and as compensation received land for his service, acquiring land in historic Mississauga in 1806-1807. His property was known as Lot 17 in the first concession north of Dundas Street, and this is situated immediately west of what is now Confederation on the north side of Dundas Street. So Lot 17, and that part is factual. Johann Schiller did acquire land here on the north side of Dundas Street, and so we can place him on the ground. He was here for a very short period of time, and that is sadly due to his death in 1816. But it is factual. He was here, he did own land, and it's the land in question that the vineyard would come to operate on. So according to the myth, if you will, so the story is Schiller was hunting along the banks of the Credit River and stumbled across some wild Lambrusca grapes, and he took some cuttings of them, planted them on his own property, and thus started a vineyard. One early account of referring to this vineyard eventually became a vineyard of such magnitude that it flourished with Clinton grapes of plumpness and fine flavor. Supposedly using his knowledge from his previous country overseas, he was able to make wine that was saleable. There was quite a number of problems with the story, and these were pointed out by Professor Richard Jarrell to a very convincing fashion. There is absolutely no documentary evidence from any of that time contemporary with Johann Schiller himself supporting any part of the story. No one writing of the Canadian wine history during the early 19th and early 20th centuries even mentioned Schiller. Henry Parker, who did plant a vineyard in Lot 17 on the same property, never mentioned Schiller or the existence of a previous vineyard. The wild grapes that grew in the Cooksville area were not Lambrusca, and nor were they Clinton grapes. Schiller could not have planted Clinton grapes because they were not recognized as a quality of grape until the 1830s, long after Schiller had passed away. And according to the evidence, documentary evidence that is factual, Schiller was actually a shoemaker by trade and essentially a mercenary soldier in the British Army, and there is no mention whatsoever of winemaking. So Factual, Schiller owned the property. Myth, perhaps most likely that he started a vineyard. However, it is the property that is key to the story, not necessarily Johann Schiller. The reference to Johann Schiller really seems to come about in newspaper accounts looking back on the property in the 1930s, 100 years or more later, looking back on it and connecting the story of Lot 17 through its successive years when it became a vineyard to kind of an earlier story of the property. It seems to be more of confusion than anything else. So we do know we are in solid footing looking back in 1859 when an individual by the name of Justin McCarthy de Courtenay suggests to the federal government to establish a wine industry in Canada, and makes reference that there is no existing wine industry at that time. That was in 1859. Really it was starting from scratch, and all the contemporaries supported or indicated that this was the case, that there was no previous attempts at a wine industry as of 1859. And we're on solid ground when we can look at the same property, Schiller's property, as of 1841, when it's purchased by Rear Admiral Sir William George Parker for a landed base in Canada for his three youngest sons, Henry, Melville, and Alberts. Melville is the one that shone the brightest, but Henry ties into the wine story at the beginning. And in 1841, Clare House, the home of the Parker family, which would later beget the name for the wine brand, Clare House is built. And Clare House in the 1930s, looking back on it, would become dubbed Chateau Clare, but it never operated under the name Chateau Clare. It was known as Clare House during the Wine Growers Association existence. Henry Parker planted a vineyard on his property, again acquired by his father in 1841. In 1858 or possibly 1859, Henry Parker is noted as starting a vineyard on the property. However, it seems likely that the operation was going nowhere. He didn't have that understanding of the process until he met and befriended and became partners with the aforementioned Justin de Courtenay, and it was the Parker de Courtenay partnership that would eventually give birth to the Canadian Vine Growers Association in 1864, 1865. By 1865, de Courtenay was in charge of the vineyard here in Cooksville, in historic Mississauga, and expansion began. And at its height of production in the late 1860s, Clare House produced as much as 50,000 gallons of wine and a considerable amount of brandy under the name Clare House. And so Clare House becomes the brand, if you will, named after the home of the Parker family. While the Parker brothers, particularly the middle brother, Sir Melville Parker, were instrumental in the financial backing of the Vine Growers Association, it was de Courtenay who was the professional vintner. He had previous experience in France, Switzerland, and Italy in the winemaking industry, and Clare House, under his direction, was the first commercial vineyard and winery in Canada. Again, 1865, it is officially up and running. And so again, we have this establishment of the Canadian Vine Growers Association under the direction of Justin de Courtenay. However, de Courtenay has a little bit of a rocky relationship, not only with the Parkers, but also with the government at the time. And after only a few years, he moves on, selling the property. The Canadian Vine Growers Association holdings under the Parker and de Courtenay partnership are sold in 1868 to Solomon White, who was actually a lawyer from the Windsor area. And under Solomon White's direction, he does appear to have tried to maintain production of it, but he too sold out in short order to George Torrance in 1876. Torrance in turn sold to Benjamin Murray in 1887, and Murray was still producing wine under the Clare House name as of 1891. However, shortly thereafter, things start to go south for the company. In 1903, Murray sells the property to Achille Rumujus, who was a French immigrant into the Cooksville area, and the vineyard was operated by his son Leopold. And it was under Leopold's direction, whether it was simply the environment or the age of the grape, the vineyard of that time, or sheer amount of work that was required. The vineyard begins to go downhill under Leopold Ramuge's direction at that time. I can't put the blame on Leopold. We don't know the circumstances of it, but it certainly begins to decline at that point. And again, through that the declining of it, it was particularly hit hard during the temperance movement here in Ontario, and the vineyard appears to have ceased operation as of 1925. And the Canadian Vine Growers Association Charter, which was established in 1865, expired in 1926. So again, that's the story in brief of Clare House, Chateau Clare, the first commercial vineyard in Canada and established here in historic Mississauga. And if you're looking for ground zero, if you will, really around the intersection of what is Parker Hill and Hillcrest today, north of Dundas Street, and between Parker Hill and Confederation Avenue was where the vineyard was located, and we have some historic pictures of the old vineyard estate. A few, but we have a couple of them that kind of highlight this fascinating, if short-lived, story of winemaking in historic Mississauga. Thank you for the question, and it's one that relates to a property that I've spent many a happy hour wandering on in the past, long before the property as we know it today came to be. It was an operational pick your own apple orchard, and for those that have been around in Mississauga for some time, it was known as the Riviera Fruit Farm, or kind of more locally as the Pinchin Farm. And not only did they have the pick your own apple orchards, but they also sold turkeys. They were raised and sold turkeys on the property as well. And so it's a fascinating bit of kind of our rural agricultural history, and it was an operational apple orchard right up until the early 2000s. I had an opportunity many years ago to do a survey of the property and to investigate and photograph many of the buildings, which unfortunately are no longer on the property, but was able to do so before they were lost. And the barn, your question around the barn fits right into the story of that. The barn isn't being rebuilt per se. It's more the remnant that was preserved. What you're seeing on the property today is the lower stone foundations of the barn. So the barn had a stone lower foundation, and then a two-story superstructure of a balloon-framed wood above it. Kind of a typical agrarian barn for mixed agricultural uses and livestock at the time, and we have some pictures of that which we'll include here as well. At one point, the barn even held a silo, which was taken down sometime in the 1950s. So the barn itself was built between 1865 and 1871. We're not entirely sure on the date of construction. There's a couple of options for the date, or a couple of mentions of a possible date. But it was built by James O'Neill and his son Patrick, who operated the farm at the time, and it was a mixed farm. They had crop, but they also had livestock, and that's where the stone foundation comes in for housing the livestock. Never a large operation at the time, but nonetheless built between 1865 and 1871. Subsequent owners of the property, including the Croziers and the Steens, also had a mixed farm here, and so the barn would have continued in that use. When the Pinchin family acquired the property in the 1930s, they introduced turkeys, and the barn was used in part for apple storage. They had a cold storage room that was added on to the barn at one point, and the barn itself was used for turkey housing, for lack of a better word. And two additional barns were also built on the property for the turkey operation. And the Pinchins operated the farm right up until the early 2000s. By the early 2000s, the old wooden barn, the one you're talking about, was no longer in serviceable condition. It was quite deteriorated at that point in time. have some stories around its deterioration. But the decision was made to demolish the barn superstructure, and that was something we were also able to document as the barn was coming down. And they left the stone. They left and capped the stone foundation, which is what you see today. With the removal of the original farmhouse and the barn foundations that we see today are the strongest reminder of the property's built history or building history on site, with the exception, of course, of the Leslie log home. However, it's a little bit of a misnomer to its connection. The Leslie log home, although it was built in 1826, actually stood elsewhere and was moved to the property in 1994. So it is the Leslie log house, which is a beautiful reminder of our past today on the landscape. Although the oldest building on the site is also the newest arrival on the site, if that makes sense, having been brought to the property in 1894. And of course, the Leslie Log Home today is the home of the Streetsville Historical Society and Archives, and a wonderful way to interact with our past and a great way to explore the history of the property as well. But in terms of the barn foundations, again, they are a remnant that was kept from the historic barn that was on the location dating to 1865 to 1871. Thank you. Thank you, Daryl, for your not only your well wishes and your kind thoughts, but also for your question this week. And I think it would be fascinating to delve certainly into the story of the York, but just in reference to your question, I argue and say that the story of the Lancaster itself is not very well known today, and we're working on some projects around exploring that significant story of our history. So I'm going to jump into the story of the Lancaster a little bit and then get to the York and kind of share that with our viewers here today. The Lancaster bomber was a prototype that was developed in England for use during the Second World War as a heavy bomber. And on September 18th, 1941, a decision was made to move the production of the Lancasters into Canada. The Lancaster was a complex machine for a country that hadn't built things on this scale before. There were over 55,000 separate parts that went into the development of the Lancaster. And the Lancasters were based on a British airplane that was brought over, a British bomber that was brought over as kind of the mock-up for Canadian production. And so they were to be interchangeable parts with the British Lancasters, but again, Canadian built. The engines were made in the United States by Packard. The original contract to build the Lancasters went to National Steel Car Corporation of Malton, who were already building the Lysander aircrafts and were involved as a subcontractor in the manufacture of Hurricanes, Ansons, and Hamptons, other aircraft at the time. However, there were questions in the federal government and from the British Bomber Command whether this company had the ability to manage the projects and the expectations of delivery of product at the time, and this uncertainty led to the expropriation by the Canadian federal government of the National Steel Car plant in Malton and setting up a Crown Corporation in 1942. As of November 4th, 1942, Victory Aircraft in Malton was born. And a Lancaster was flown across the Atlantic, as I previously mentioned, in August of 1942 to act as a pattern. And so Victory Aircraft is born to produce the Lancasters in support of the British war effort. The workforce initially in November of 1942 at Victory Aircraft was approximately 3,300 employees, and this increased to just over 9,500 employees by 1944. Most of them were initially unskilled, and about a quarter of the workers on the assembly line were women. The Canadian prototype with serial number KB700, KB700, rolled off Victory Aircraft Assembly Line on August 1st, 1943, almost exactly a year after the first pattern aircraft was flown to Canada. This aircraft, the first one to roll off the assembly line, was known as the Roar Express, and became really kind of a famous Canadian aircraft prior to its loss in action. And much publicity was made of its christening, its first flight, and its departure and ultimate arrival in England. At the time of production, production at Victory Aircraft reached one aircraft per day, an astounding feat for a fledgling Canadian company. A total of 430 Lancasters were built in Malton, and they were well received in England. They were assigned to a bomber group known as Number 6 Bomber Command, and this was really an all-Canadian effort in support of the war overseas. And were considered to be an exceptional aircraft at the time. One of the AV Row company executives remarked at the time that this was how an aircraft should be built. Great performance, great power, very reliable aircraft at the time. One of the fascinating stories, and we won't delve into it too much, but it is worth looking at, is the organization that involved taking the finished aircraft from Canada and delivering them overseas. And that organization that was brought into existence was known as Ferry Command. There's a fantastic book on Ferry Command. I'm about halfway through it myself, called The History of RAF Ferry Command, and well worth the read. That is by Carl A. Christie, entitled Ocean Bridge. And it's one thing to build the aircraft, but something we often forget about is how to deliver the aircraft overseas. They had to fly over the North Atlantic for the most part, and delivery into Scotland and England and into the war zones. Fascinating endeavor. There's some myths around it that suggest that the aircraft were flown by women, although there were women involved specifically in the development of the aircraft and the manufacturing of the aircraft, and also in the delivery of aircraft by the RCAF to the various locations where they had to serve. There were women pilots there. There were not women who flew from Canada overseas. That's a little bit of a myth, and that's dispelled in the book Ocean Bridge. But there were certainly significant women women's involvement in the development of the Lancaster, and in some cases in the delivery of the Lancaster once the planes had reached Britain. But that being said, again, Ocean Bridge, a great book to review on a very specific element of the war effort here in Canada. The Canadian-built Lancasters served very well during the war, with again 430 being developed in Malton or being made in Malton, and just around 100 of them being lost in wartime service. After the war, most of the Lancasters came back to Canada. There was a historic flight of Lancasters across Canada into Alberta, and they were disposed of, many of them, by selling them to farmers for a few $100s each, really for the use of the recycling of their parts and kind of the aluminum and the glass and the wire and the fuel and all that sort of stuff. Some made their ways into restaurants, some into museums. Many were broken up and used in different different processes, or different configurations and whatnot, largely for parts again. However, there were several that were kept at the time, and beginning in 1946, many of those preserved Lancasters were modified for service in Canada with the Royal Canadian Air Force. There were a total of 9 different versions or conversions of the Lancaster after the Second World War, and some of which involved dozens of planes, some of which involved only a single plane. 14 were modified for aerial and photo reconnaissance work, and many of these aircraft did aerial mapping of central and northern Canada, and they continued to serve until 1962. In 1948, some 70 Lancasters were modified for maritime reconnaissance and patrol aircraft, primarily in anti-submarine role. Again, this is the beginning of the Cold War at the time as well. 8 of the Lancasters built in Canada by Victory Aircraft were not completed as bombers, but rather as long-distance transport aircraft during the Second World War. These aircraft operated under the Canadian Government Transatlantic Air Service from 1943 to 47. And by the end of the war, these 8 modified Lancasters had completed hundreds of trips across the Atlantic. But when we get into kind of your story or your inquiry, Daryl, around the conversion, in the years following the war, when Aviro Canada takes over the Victory Aircraft plant, some modifications are made to the Lancaster plan. This is before the development of the CF-100 and the CF-105, better known as the Averero. They're still involved in kind of that production taking over from Victory Aircraft. One of which, one of the marks or the variations of the Lancaster that were produced after the war were known as the Mark 15 or the Lincoln, the Lancaster Lincoln. And it first flew on October 25th, 1945, the only one completed by Victory Aircraft, where there were plans to build over 200 of them. But the war in the Pacific ended rather quickly, and so there was no reason to continue. But the Lincoln was an enlarged version of the Lancaster, and it featured a modified nose section, a stretched out rear section for larger capacities, a passenger bay as well, larger wingspan, more powerful engines, etc. And so this was just a modification that was made in 1945. Other Lancaster derivative built in Canada was the FM 400, which was better known as the Avro York. And this is to your question today for the York. In 1943, Victory Aircraft was given an order to build 50 of these aircraft to be used in transatlantic service, and production of these continued on after Victory Aircraft under Aviro Canada. The York modification was significant that the fuselage, unlike the Lancaster bomber, the fuselage of the York was square-shaped in cross-section rather than rounded, and this was to give the aircraft more usable space, both for passenger service and for freight. Freight as in anything that you can imagine as a freight vehicle, including a lot of them were used for mail delivery for Canadian forces. A number of the Avro Yorks continued to fly in Canada as privately owned transports during the 1950s. The York saw both military and civilian service between 1943 and its eventual retirement in 1964, including being used during the Berlin blockade and airlift in 1948-49. So the York, a variation of the Lancaster, again, not well known. Not only is the York not well known, but also the Lancaster in those Canadian sense. There are some great resources out there understanding and looking at the Lancaster. Some books out there. We've started to acquire some things, just trying to kind of shed some light on the Lancasters as well. And there's another one there, and we have quite a few. But well worth taking a look at the kind of these iconic airplanes of the time, and remembering that this is truly a Canadian contribution to the war effort overseas, and just an amazing thing to delve into what they were able to create here at home in support of the war effort during the Second World War. And that's the story of, in brief, of the Lancaster bomber, but also of the relatively lesser known Lancaster variation known as the Avro York. Continuing with our aircraft theme here on Asking a Historian this week, we have a question from Ian around the Super Connie. Better known as officially known as the Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation, better known as the Super Connie. It was an American-built airliner that was produced between 1951 and 1958. And it became, by many aircraft enthusiasts, they view the Super Connie as one of the most beautiful and iconic commercial aircraft ever produced. TransCanada Airlines acquired 8 Super Constellations in 1954. Aside from its unique design and attractive curves, the Super Connie brought something which proved invaluable to the development of long-haul flight, comfortable flight, if you will, over long distances, and that was a pressurized cabin that allowed for flight at higher altitudes by flying above active weather systems in the jet stream. And this allowed for fuel savings, increased speed, and enabled non-stop coast-to-coast commercial flights in North America, something we take for granted today for those of us that fly. At the height of its popularity, airlines all over the world flew the Super Connie. More than 800 aircraft were built in total before being phased out by the development of the commercial jet aircraft. Most Super Connies had been retired by 1980. Back to your question, Ian, about the one up in Malton. A beloved aircraft, although for those who've collected stories and tried to preserve the aircraft in Malton, many of us don't realize that it was only in Malton for a very, very short period of time. But many may remember the Super Connie that was converted to a restaurant along Deary Road in Malton near Pearson International Airport. The aircraft in question was served with TransCanada Airlines between 1954 and 1962. So really a short-lived career. For about 8 years it was a commercial aircraft. It was sold to new owners in 1963, again in 1964, and again in 1965, although it apparently never flew after 1962. In 1968, again under new ownership, a decision was made to strip the aircraft and convert it into a restaurant. However, this did not materialize at the time, and the aircraft was stored in a disassembled state in a hangar in Quebec until 1985, and this is in part why it was in such good condition, in that it just was not being used. In 1987, the aircraft was reassembled and it was put on display at Saint Jean Port Joli, Quebec. And it stayed there for only a handful of years, and in September of 1995 it was acquired by Philip Yull of Toronto, and the aircraft was brought to Etobicoke and installed, if you will, or parked at the Regal Constellation Hotel for use as a conference facility and a cocktail lounge. And so the conversion to a restaurant is complete as of 1995-96. In 1998, the aircraft was moved to the north end of Pearson International Airport near the intersection of what is Deary Road and Torburn Road in Malton, where it was opened as a bar and a restaurant. And this is the reference that you make in your question to the Super Connie on Deary Road. Again, moved to that site in 1998. In 2002, the business closed, and after about 4 years of trying to find a new home for it, and very quietly efforts were made here at home to try to find a new home for the Connie in Mississauga. However, it did not come to pass, and in 2006, the plane was sold to the Seattle Museum of Flight. It was relocated there in 2007, and it has been fully restored and repainted in the TransCanada Airlines livery, and is now on display again in Seattle at the Seattle Museum of Flight. So the Super Connie from Malton still exists, just no longer in Mississauga. So if you want to go see it, the Seattle Museum of Flight in Seattle is its new home and potentially permanent home. So the Super Connie, well loved, well remembered, and still with us to this day. So keep searching the skies, and maybe we'll have a Super Connie fly overhead once again, as it did for many years under TransCanada Airlines. So thanks for the question.